Thank you, Nir. Thanks, everyone, for coming. It's with a little bit of regret that I announce today's speaker, mostly because this is the last of a three-part series that I've enjoyed immensely. This is part of the Data to Decision-Making series. And if you recall, we had earlier seminars from Vanessa Tobias and Lauren Damon talking in turn about their particular participation in this effort for the IEP and with the IEP. And so I kind of wish this could go on for like a lot more seminars, because I think we have a lot more things to say and you might find it interesting. But I guess that'll be for another seminar series. So it is indeed with pleasure that I introduce one of my most trusted colleagues, Louise Conrad, for her talk today. A little bit of background from Louise. She's a program manager at the Department of Water Resources for Estuarine Science and Synthesis, which is fortunate because that's what she's talking about today. Her work in this position includes visioning and the doing of a synthesis program for the IEP, or the Interagency Ecological Program. She conducts applied science to evaluate resource management for various actions in the Delta. Louise's background is in fisheries, particularly in California. Before arriving at DWR, Louise studied largemouth bass and invasive vegetation in the Delta as a postdoctoral scholar at UC Davis. And during her Ph.D. research on steelhead trout, Louise cut her teeth with applied interagency science in the Russian River watershed, where she co-led development of a conservation hatchery program for the endangered coho salmon. So I hope you will join me in warmly welcoming Louise Conrad. Her topic today is IEP synthesis efforts and how they're being used to inform management. Louise.
Hi, everyone. I want to say thank you first to Nir and to the Delta Science Program for this invitation to be here. I want to say I really appreciate the practice of brown bag seminars and the chance for us from diverse affiliations to get together and talk about something that is of common interest and importance. And also the opportunity to talk about one of my favorite topics, which is synthesis. I hope that in this talk I will be able to define for you what synthesis means to us in our enterprise, I hope, but certainly within IEP, the Interagency Ecological Program. And I hope in doing that I can bring you some examples of what we have done successfully, talk about some challenges that we have moving forward, and perhaps one of the most important things I hope to do is to celebrate the people that make synthesis happen, because it certainly doesn't happen without people. So first of all, what is synthesis? This is, I think, becoming a buzzword that people use quite a bit, and I'm not sure when we say synthesis, we know exactly what we're talking about, or we know exactly what we mean to say. So let us be careful for a second in defining it. And notably, this is a word that comes to the surface in many different fields. Chemistry is probably the primary one, where if you have multiple compounds, you put them together, you are synthesizing them into a more complex compound. The textile industry uses synthesis a lot, think synthetic fabrics. And if you type in synthesis into Google Images, these are some images that you get. So we are talking about synthesis of environmental data here. And what do we mean by that? And it turns out that this is something that is thought about a lot and actually has been written about a lot. We are not the only ones to think about synthesis of environmental data. And there's some really great, inspiring articles in the primary literature of what synthesis is in ecology. And so I just want to take a chance to actually highlight one of my favorite papers, which comes from Stephen Carpenter at the University of Wisconsin-Madison in 2009. He wrote this paper in Bioscience that talks about accelerating synthesis in ecology and environmental sciences. So I'm just going to share with you a few quotes because I think they elegantly explain what we mean by synthesis. So first, he defines it, and this is the definition that I think works best for what we are trying to do. Synthesis occurs when disparate data, concepts, or theories are integrated in ways that yield new knowledge, insights, or explanations. Now this, I want to be clear here for a second. When we are saying synthesis, it isn't necessarily the same thing as analysis. Certainly by bringing multiple data sets together, you are synthesizing them and maybe analyzing them. However, to do synthesis, you might not necessarily be using data. You might be reading papers on multiple different aspects of a certain field and synthesizing that information into a review or distilling that information into something that is digestible for the public or for managers. So I wanted to make that point that this is sometimes distinct from analysis. Why do we need synthesis? Again, Stephen Carpenter has a nice way of putting it. The burden of knowledge that is embedded in increasing numbers of journals, papers, and books requires synthesis if problem solvers are to use that massive information efficiently. We are in a world that is rich in information. Certainly we are in ecology. And we need synthesis in order to digest some of that information. And I don't have a quote for it, well, I will, but Stephen Carpenter makes a point that centers, kind of nuclei of synthesis activity embedded in synthesis centers are really the way to get synthesis work done, where you have focal groups of people and scientists that are allowed to focus and get computer database management kind of support for doing synthesis, and it's these centers that can accelerate the field. So just to put it in his words here, synthesis centers offer isolation from distractions, provide neutral ground, encouraging a greater diversity of participation. And in this setting, participants work toward fast progress on exciting questions. So bringing home the point that we are faced with many different complex, increasingly complex questions, and we are going to need synthesis to help us, equip us with knowledge to face them. We have an example locally in California for a synthesis center that he is talking about, the National Center for Ecological Analysis and Synthesis, and they are supporting synthesis in many ways, in part simply by helping with management of diverse data sets, and then, as Stephen Carpenter notes, bringing people together to work in a dedicated way to synthesizing information for management. It turns out that the NC's model is not unique over the world. We have seen since actually the late 80s an international growth of synthesis centers over the world. We have examples from China, from Europe, multiple places in the United States, and until recently in Australia. And now we have 11 total now in the world, I think, based on the information that I was able to look at. And in fact, now we have an international synthesis consortium where there is a group of people that actually come together from these synthesis centers to synthesize what is it working well for them. And so we have synthesis of synthesis. And it's a testament to how important this is. And I bring you this context because I think it's important as we now move into talking about our Bay Delta system and the Interagency Ecological Program, how we are not the only ones. And we have models to follow of what will work, what we maybe shouldn't try, and we would do well to look at these models, I think. So synthesis in IEP, what does that look like? And why do we need it? Now, perhaps you don't need the convincing that we need synthesis in IEP, but I do want to make a case for why this is important. 3 reasons. The first reason is if there is an estuary in the world that has huge volumes, longevity, and breadth of data, we are one of the top of the list. we have over 5 decades of monitoring. This image from Brian Schreier, Department of Water Resources, shows you the fisheries and plankton monitoring and some discrete water quality monitoring that happens and its scope over the system. We are collecting data from everything from water quality, nutrients, to sturgeon. So we are sampling the entire system. At any given day, someone is out in the field collecting data. And this doesn't even show you the large network of high-frequency monitoring that is happening, where every 15 minutes, over 150 stations are collecting a suite of data about water quality. So we have a ton of data. And to really leverage it, we will need synthesis to bring these data sets to be able to talk to each other to address questions for management. Another reason that we need synthesis, because increasingly we have needs for adaptive management of water project operation, habitat restoration, and this work of adaptive management will require synthesis. This is your wheel of adaptive management that came out in our local journal, San Francisco Estuary of Watershed Sciences, and I think many of us have seen this before. I want to note that this third of that circle, where we are planning to do projects and doing them and then evaluating and responding, that evaluation phase is synthesis. We have to be able to look at what we've done and provide timely information to adjust that project in the future. IEP data, since it is so extensive, will be key to that effort. Some examples very quickly. We have this, what we call the flash report, which is really the evaluation of the fall 2011 low salinity habitat investigations. We had wet conditions and a whole suite of studies were on the water looking at what was the ecosystem response to those wet conditions. And this report synthesizes what we observed. In a more recent example, Department of Water Resources recently operated the Sassoon Marsh Salinity Control Gates to improve salinity habitat for Delta smelt in Sassoon Marsh in August of 2018. We need now to be looking at exactly what happened. Do we want to do this again? How should we modify it, if we should at all? And if the plan is to do this again in summer of 2019, there is a large suite of data to analyze and synthesize now. And then finally, as you are likely aware, as part of California Eco Restore and other initiatives, there are plans to restore, and restoration is underway now to restore tidal wetland habitat. We need to understand if this, as we move forward with continuing these projects, is it having the intended effects? All of this is synthesis work that is directly informative to management. Okay, and one last plug for synthesis is that synthesis can help address the increasing complexity of managing our Bay Delta system in a changing ecosystem. And again, I want to look outward for a second, away from our system to the primary literature, where from some researchers from Texas A&M University, this is again one of my favorite papers, have predicted an extreme future for estuaries as climate change proceeds. They note that estuaries stand at the cusp of both oceanic and freshwater environments and will experience increased variability from both of those systems. And yet, we don't totally understand what are the effects of drought or extreme flood on ecosystems, especially perhaps in managed systems like ours, where it's not just Mother Nature tinkering with knobs, it's also us. So how do all of those anthropogenic and natural influences affect what we see? Our Bay Delta system will certainly not be an exception to this type of change that we are seeing moving forward. This is January 2017, the Roaring River levees in Sassoon Marsh overtopping. We were likely to see more of this. And this is all happening in the context of an ecosystem we know is already changing, because we have seen and are continuing to see species declines and changing in habitat. For example, invasive aquatic vegetation coverage in Liberty Island is now, by recent estimates, covering 35% of the waterways, where just over a decade ago it was less than 5%. So that is significant, and it's going to have impacts on the systems that we're trying to restore. what can synthesis do? Well, synthesis can help assess and track the trends we're seeing. If we don't understand the trends, we can't address them. We can also leverage data to start predicting specifically what will our management challenges be. Existing data, and I should have also put models that are going to be very important for making these predictions. And we need to do that in a way that is specific to our Bay Delta system, not California as a whole or the Western United States as a whole. And we can also review and find gaps in our existing knowledge so we know where to focus our science management. So I hope that at this point we're all feeling really excited for the need for synthesis. So now is where the work starts. How are we going to do it? And you'll be happy to know that IEP has a conceptual model for this because that's what we do, right? This is, and I won't belabor that point, it's just a little bit of a joke, but it is actually important to think about where do we exist within the science landscape? Where is science and synthesis science specifically existing within our science landscape? And here is one place where I want to mention that this is where the people are going to be really important because we're going to have to roll up our sleeves and decide to do this. We already are, but I think the challenges are such that we can even do more. But let's start breaking down the tasks of synthesis, specifically what is entailed in synthesis, and think about how do we break these up in order to get to our final goal of information that is usable. Okay, so you're going to see this, what I'm about to show you throughout the rest of the presentation, and I want you to tell me if it got boring later. But we have building blocks of synthesis. This is how I have been thinking about it, and I want to say a lot of this thinking is highly influenced by the colleagues that you saw on the previous slide, among others. So one is IEP, and I would say our science enterprise in general needs to enhance its open science practices. Perhaps open science is yet another one of these buzzwords where what are we really talking about? Well, I'll tell you what I think about, and I want to acknowledge specifically Vanessa Tobias for opening our eyes to this through her work with the Data Utilization Work Group. But this is about increasing the accessibility and visibility of IEP data and its work overall. We need to make it easier for people that are potential collaborators to see us and then use our information and our data. Okay, so there are some specific ways to do this. These are just two examples. There's one, the Environmental Data Initiative, which is an NSF-funded open access data repository. More on that in a minute. And also GitHub, which is an online tool for social coding and analysis teams. It is a way to catalyze the work that we do and bring in collaborators. Secondly, as I mentioned, we need to work on integrating our monitoring data sets. As I showed you in that previous slide, we had all of the IEP surveys that are happening over the course of a year. Many of them are collecting data on similar or the same type of environmental parameters. So it would make sense if we could integrate those data across data sets so that we have one data set or can access one data set for, say, zooplankton or phytoplankton or delta smelt or tule perch. So, for example, I think there are at least 6, probably more, surveys and studies that are monitoring zooplankton. And, well, Karen Kafitz is here. She is a brave person that has decided, yes, it's worthwhile to try to integrate these and evaluate both field and lab practices. How are we collecting and then processing these samples? And are there differences that are limiting for us to make these data sets talk to each other? Our goal is a single integrated data set across surveys, which, by the way, if you write the code to do it, then you can post that on GitHub, and then anyone can come in and look at over 6 data sets and have a nice, beautiful zooplankton data set for our estuary. And with so many collaborators, potential collaborators at UC Davis and other universities and beyond, I think that's worth doing. Okay, so these are fundamentals, but then we need to have teams. We're going to have specific topics that are approaching us, that are staring us in the face, saying we need answers about Kassun Marsh salinity control gates and its effects by, say, March of 2019. Well, then we're going to need teams to do that. And we need to have another piece of wisdom from the best practices literature for synthesis is that it helps if you are multidisciplinary and engage a diverse group with your synthesis because you're more likely to have novel approaches that may be helpful for uncovering information you wouldn't otherwise. But this is where the teams are going to be based on a topic. They are not the same team from project to project. It is really dependent on the expertise that is needed. And this is where the conceptual model building, the review of all the information is happening, and also the quantitative analyses, with the final goal of getting to distilled information that we can share with others, that speaks to the needs of management or educating the interested public. And so I put Steve Culberson as our lead scientist here. He is particularly good at communicating information, I think. However, he is not the only one that needs to be doing it. So all of us have work to do in that area. So this is kind of a pyramid of what we're doing now. I want to start pointing to some examples of how we have been successful in approaching and doing work underneath each of these umbrellas of synthesis or building blocks of synthesis. So IEP is now on the Environmental Data Initiative. In fact, and again, the goal here is we make IEP data accessible anywhere. Data and metadata are formatted consistently. And by accessible anywhere, this actually means that with just a few clicks, you can import an entire 30 years of data into R and see all the metadata. That is very exciting. And you can actually do this with 2 data sets from IEP now. In fact, the featured data contribution on EDI this month is the YOLO Bypass Fisheries Monitoring Program. That's, you can go online and see that right now. That is our screw trap that has been operated since 1997. And you can get all the data from that and other parts of the survey there. Also recently added to EDI in just the last month or 2 is the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service Delta Juvenile Fish Monitoring Program, another one of our long-term fisheries data sets. And now these data sets have a digital object identifier, and they are citable in the primary literature. I want to make a special note that we have certain people to thank for this. This is a heavy lift to get this to happen. We have Vanessa Tobias, Melinda Bearwald, Brian Schreier, Brittany Davis, and Brian Maharshda as well. So this is a major service to IEP, I think. All right, so now let's talk a little bit about synthesis teams before I go into some examples of some specific work. I think it's very important to note that teams happen and are formed based on the need and the topic, and that they come in many different sizes. Not every synthesis team needs to be or should be 15 to 20 people. We have done that, but it isn't necessarily the right format for every topic. So we have an approach of small teams. These teams, 2, 3 people sometimes, are more likely to be informal. They are more likely to be generated, I think, from a bottom-up initiative. Our scientists that are working close to the actual collection of data know their data best, and they have a unique perspective on how their data can and should be used, and they may have ideas that managers that spend more of their time going to meetings and planning wouldn't have. So this is a very valuable part of synthesis and probably one of the most promising avenues, I think, for enhancing our ecological understanding of the system if we can engage these small teams, and we have. And then there are often larger teams, and these are more often likely to be formal, as in they are explicit elements in the Interagency Ecological Program work plan. They are probably more likely to be top-down initiatives where managers said, we really need information about X. Please do this. And so then the scientists need to figure this out. How will we do this? I'll give you some examples of that. In this case, we're more likely, simply because it's more people, we're probably going to have broader representation across affiliations. Okay, so some examples from small teams. And again, I hope that the appreciation of the people that I'm here talking, but it's really a lot of scientists that are not me that have done a lot of this work. Here's an important question. What does the future temperature climate look like for Delta smelt? And with a pretty diverse but small group of people, led by Larry Brown, they took this approach where they said, okay, we have climate change models. We're able to downscale them so that we can predict temperature conditions 100 years out in specific regions of the Delta. And then we also know from physiology lab-based research what Delta smelts are made of in terms of temperature. When, at what degree do they start getting really stressed out or die or maybe are not going to be able to mature? And they put all this together in, I think, a very successful, beautiful synthesis project, published it in PLOS One in 2016. And there are lots of tidbits of wisdom that come out of this paper if you read the discussion. The real take-home point here is, yes, we are going to see significant thermal habitat constriction for Delta smelt over the next 50 years. And I didn't have room to put it on the slide, but they show that this is going to be especially prevalent in the North Delta. And they remark this is actually where much of the tidal wetland restoration is planned for in the North Delta, but unfortunately it will be warm. So I think that's a worthy consideration for management. Another example of a small team comes from Shruti Khanna, where she wanted to know, are flooding patterns different across years and Delta regions? Why is this important? Well, many of our native fishes respond well to variability in the amount of the flooded area that's available. And shallow water habitat that occurs ephemerally as a result in wet years may be very important to exchange of materials like nutrients. So how does our system operate? And she was able to take a long time series of imagery where the developers of this data set used the imagery to classify over the whole globe for every month from 1984 to 2015 the wetted area. So this is a global surface water data set that is 21 years. And Shruti is a pretty remarkable spatial analyst, and she said, okay, I can use that. And she looked at specific regions of our delta and looked at, okay, when you have wet years where you're likely to see flooded area, if you're ever going to see it, and you compare those to dry years, do we have a different signal of wet years across these different delta regions? And she showed that only in the Cosumnes region, the Northeast Delta, and the Yolo Bypass do you really have a signal of wet years. Otherwise, if you're in the Central Delta or in some areas of Sassoon, you're not going to see the same amount of habitat regardless of what year it is. And I think that's pretty remarkable. That was Shruti's initiative. Now we're going to move to larger teams. What have we accomplished in some of our larger teams? And this is an example that I hope many of you know well, is led by Larry Brown and Anke Mueller-Solger when she was the IEP lead scientist. And they asked, with a large group of people that was largely the IEP science management team and became known as the Management Analysis Synthesis Team, or MAST, they wanted to know, why was 2011 a good year for Delta smelt? That's our fall mid-water trawl time series of indices, and that red circled area year is 2011, and we saw that bump in Delta smelt. Why did that happen? This project was an extended effort where we developed a conceptual model, and then we tested our hypotheses about why 2011 was such a good year with hypotheses that were prompted from the conceptual model. This conceptual model has now been used in many different formats. I think most notably, perhaps, the Delta Smelt Resiliency Strategy, which came out from the Natural Resources Agency in 2016, where we have a science-based list of 13 actions that are designed to address the drivers of Delta Smelt decline. And so I hope this speaks to the question of how is synthesis informing management? This is case in point. And another case in point, another larger team. This is one that came directly from the IEP directors. They said, we'd really like you to evaluate our monitoring networks for winter run Chinook salmon and sturgeon. And Rachel Johnson and Joe Hugline from NOAA Fisheries stepped up to the task. And I'll use the winter run Chinook example primarily because that was the one that I was most directly involved in. I think this group did a beautiful job of evaluating 11 data sets and determining exactly what do we get out of them. Do we getting genetic information? Are we getting growth information? Are we getting timing information? What are we getting from each of these data sets? And where are we falling down and letting our finger come off the pulse of the winter run Chinook salmon population? This work is published in our local San Francisco Estuary Watershed Sciences and suggesting real science advancements. How can we manage our science going forward for winter run Chinook salmon and our monitoring network to improve it so that we can inform our management better? There was also a major conceptual model effort, and like the Delta Smelt resiliency strategy, we now have largely because of this effort, a salmon resiliency strategy that is also a list of actions that we should take on to improve conditions for this species. Okay, one final example from larger teams that is probably our most recent example is that we had these high flows in 2017. We want to know what the ecosystem responses were. Again, this is responsive to the biological opinion call for management of wet conditions and above normal in wet years, and was this action effective at improving habitat for Delta Smelt? Again, we used our Delta Smelt conceptual model and leveraged multiple science collaborations to get some information. One, we found out through a lot of pretty innovative work from Michael McWilliams at Anchor QEA that summer was very warm in 2017. And this happened regardless of maybe conditions were wetter, but it was hot. And Jim Hobbs, who at UC Davis, who does quite a bit of work with Delta Smelt otoliths and understanding growth rates, has shown us that we also had reduced growth. So we maybe didn't get the response from Delta Smelt that we would have liked to have seen. Was it flow-based? Perhaps not. Brian Maharshda was, and Larry Brown led this effort and are still completing, the team is completing a report. There's a large team that's involved with this. So those are some examples of how the synthesis work has been responsive, I think, to management. Taking a moment maybe to look forward, we have big plans for 2019. Perhaps we're crazy to take this on. It's going to be a lot of work, but I think some of the efforts that I just told you about have motivated people and shown people that this work is really important and we can do this. So we are biting off a big chunk, and I'm going to tell you about that using our trusty building block pyramid. So first of all, data set integration. Sorry that font looks really small up there, but there was a lot to put on this slide. As I mentioned before, Karen Kafitz is going to address zooplankton sample methodologies and try to create an integrated data set across programs. We have John Franco Saraceno and Sarah Lesmeister from Department of Water Resources that have noted we need to evaluate the water quality monitoring network for real-time data. There are, like I said, over 100, I wouldn't be surprised if there had 200 sensors out there, not sensors, stations, multiple sensors per station, collecting data. And what are some perhaps gaps, but also where are we duplicating efforts where we don't need to? And then this falls under data set integration because perhaps we can make recommendations for improving the system and maybe along the way bring data together that isn't already talking to each other. In the open science realm, the IEP Data Utilization Work Group, which was previously run by Vanessa Tobias, who has gone on to become a mathematical statistician at U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. Congratulations, Vanessa. Now is being run by both Steve Culberson and Brittany Davis. And the work there is extensive. I didn't have space to list it, but hopefully for starters, more data sets on Environmental Data Initiative. And then we have our teams that we'd like to do and that we are planning to do. All of these are actually in the IEP work plan that will be coming out for 2019, or will be, assuming it's approved. We have Vanessa working on forecasting nutrient invasion in the Delta. Shruti has a rich data set for spatial, for coverage of aquatic vegetation, and then overlaying that with treatment records. Where has the Division of Boating and Waterways of state parks been using herbicide over the last decade plus? and what are the signals of efficacy or lack of efficacy that we are seeing? What recommendations can we make for control of this pervasive invasive species problem? And then we have more work to do on ecosystem effects of flow alteration. In 2018, DWR Water Resources conducted 2 major actions. One was operation of the Sassoon Marsh salinity control gates, which I mentioned previously, and then also routing water through Yolo bypass to stimulate an enhanced food web in the North Delta region. And we have work to do to evaluate those, and again, need to do that on a very timely basis. And then finally, well, not finally, and the 2 last ones are Brian Maharsda has decided it would be a good idea to look at multiple data sets, including the enhanced delta smelt monitoring data set, leverage that for other species besides delta smelt. What does it tell us about juvenile Chinook salmon, and can we integrate those data with other IEP data sets? For the climate change project work team, we would like to start a climate change project work team. We don't have one. This is a gap, I think, in our work, and yet a very important one. And we have the pleasure of at least initially working with Katerina Pian here, who has taken on the large task of taking all of the high-frequency temperature data and putting it into one data set so that we can start looking at trends in water temperature using our high-resolution data. Finally, our end goal is to get to this distilled information, and this is where really each one of these teams has its own pyramid that it has to complete, and at the top of each one of these teams there is a communication effort that needs to happen once there's information available. But I did want to note that we are doing some work, too, to have a synthetic document for status and trends that we see from IEP data sets. We currently don't have a singular place where you can go and see the time series of multiple surveys at once. And wouldn't that be great if you could go online and see, well, has water temperature increased? What's happening with water clarity? Can I see what's happening with fall run Chinook salmon? And we are trying to take that on with a few of us at Department of Water Resources and other agencies like Department of Fish and Wildlife. So hopeful that this first iteration of this document will be online soon. So I want to end with an acknowledgement that in the long term, this is a huge chunk of work that we're taking on. And this looks great, and we have these amazing scientists that all want to help out. Some of them, but not all of them, have within their job descriptions dedicated time for synthesis. But all of them, for sure, don't get to do that solely. And I hope what you can see from this is that this presentation in general, this is a lot of work to do this. This is not a part-time job. And I think that this is where we can remind ourselves of the benefits of synthesis centers and what Stephen Carpenter wrote in his 2009 article, that we have this model of synthesis centers offering isolation from distraction, providing neutral ground, encouraging greater diversity of participation. Those are 3 points that this is where we can think hard about how we can do better, especially in offering a dedicated space organizationally for synthesis. I don't think we have done that yet, and yet we are taking on quite a task, especially if you consider climate change and the scale of the management actions that are proposed and are now being enacted for our system. So we need to think programmatically about what we can do to make this a protected space for synthesis and the communication from this. Celebrating all the while all the people that have said, yep, I want to do this while I'm not running a monitoring program or supervising staff. I want to do a zooplankton synthesis, or I want to do start a climate change project work team. So I'm happy, I hope there is time for questions, and I leave you with this, my favorite quote from about synthesis from E.O. Wilson, that the world henceforth will be run by synthesizers. I certainly hope it will be run by synthesizers. People that are able to put together the right information at the right time, think critically about it, and then make important choices wisely. Thank you for the chance to be here, and I hope that there are some questions.
Thank you, Louise. That was really great. We definitely have time for questions. I'm going to swap microphones. But also, once we're done with questions in this room, then we will go online to see if there are any questions online. Hopefully this one's a little better. Yeah?
Hi, thanks. Jessica Pearson, quick question for you. What are some of the funding challenges that you run into as it relates to performing the synthesis work? Can you talk a little bit about funding opportunities, funding challenges?
So that's a very good question. I think the main thing that we don't have, and perhaps I could have made this point even better, is just the dedicated staff. So it's really about finding the space to make positions. Department of Water Resources, we have had some successes. So first I want to acknowledge that. Department of Fish and Wildlife was able to get 3 senior scientist positions for synthesis. And that has been a major success. Other agencies, including DWR, have not had the same success. And perhaps what I would say is the funding, I think that we can find the money, we can use the money that we have if we want to. And some of this is not just about, well, we just need more people, we need more staff. We also have to decide to use the money and the resources and the people that we have to devote them to synthesis. That doesn't mean we can stop doing monitoring, but where there are scientist positions that aren't attached to a clear supervisory role or a clear role of running a monitoring program, for example, perhaps there's space to do that and make that a priority.
Do you have some clear idea about strategic planning for your synthesis, like, down the road, next 5 years, related to Delta, science planning, adaptive management? So do you have some direction?
Are you talking about topics, specific topics?
Strategy, topics. Okay. How is that tied up with the Delta Science Plan?
Yeah, good point, because the Delta Science Plan does a nice, well, at least the public draft does a nice job of explaining, yes, we need this. I would like to see a couple things, and this is, I want to say, my opinion, not necessarily something that has been agreed upon by everyone. I would like to see us, one, enhance our staff resources across all agencies. I would like to see state and federal agencies jointly be participating in synthesis and identifying the tasks to synthesize together. So we need to have a kind of a synthesis steering group, I would say, that helps to do the reaching out and the communication that we need to identify topics that are ripe for synthesis, and that should engage also the project work teams, which are our scientists that are on the ground, and those teams are also open to the public, so it's an opportunity for broad input. So that group would be responsible for that reaching out and identifying topics. We don't really have a clear steering group for synthesis now. So that would be great. And the other thing that I think that we really ought to do is that the fact that there is all this really good, inspiring literature that talks about the value of synthesis, and we have papers we can go to that say, here's your best practices for doing synthesis work. We shouldn't be recreating the wheel. We should be looking at what others are doing and modeling ourselves. And topically, I think one of the things that was striking to me in the very recent past is that I had the chance to attend the All Scientists meeting for the Long-Term Ecological Research Network. That was in early October in Asilomar. And one of the sessions that I went to where was a series of 5-minute talks from leaders of different long-term ecological research stations that spanned from the Arctic to Mexico. And they all presented what are they seeing, what are the signals that they are seeing of climate change. And I want to say that about 75% of them were able to show some measure of water temperature or temperature increase. Maybe it was soil, maybe it was air, maybe it was water, but it was powerful to see a group of scientists get together and all say, yep, we're seeing temperature increase, check. That's something that IEP and I think Delta Science and the Delta Science enterprise in general is not doing. We are very inward looking now. We can do more to look outward, and we don't have to recreate the wheel to do that. We can start collaborating with a group like the NCEA's, National Center for Ecological Analysis and Synthesis. It's not that far away, and we can use them. I think they have support for management of diverse data sets like ours. And we can start looking at what other urban estuaries are out there that might have comparable data sets where we could start doing. Let's do a synthesis of urban estuaries and what are some patterns and trends that we may be seeing. That would help put us in context, and then would also put us in touch with researchers that are tracking having some of the same or parallel challenges, like with endangered species or invasive species. And so I think it's a combination of bolstering our own staff and taking care of our own house and cleaning up our own data, making it more accessible, and then also looking outward to other groups, other scientists and synthesis centers so that we can build our program. Thanks for the question. A little long-winded, but sorry.
I have a quick question. You showed some really interesting syntheses that the IEP is planning on working on in 2019. Would you say the underlying goal of those is to inform management, or are there other goals too?
Okay, let me go to it, just because there's so many, it's harder. If you look at the teams, forecasting nutrient invasion in the Delta, efficacy of aquatic vegetation treatment, ecosystem effects of flow alteration. Those are directly responsive to management. We are trying to inform management on some of the most difficult issues that we have. How do you route flow? What do you do when nutria are coming to eat up all the wetlands we're trying to restore? And we've been treating aquatic vegetation since 1991. It's only growing. So that's all. Those are management issues. Then we have climate change project work team and temperature synthesis. I think that is where, in the answer I just gave for the previous question, where we are trying to look outward and say, okay, we don't want to be overly immersed in our own very specific issues. We need to start thinking about ourselves in the context of our changing globe. And water temperature seemed like one that was ripe for some quantitative synthesis now. So that may be not directly, but it's certainly management related, as our operations are going to be challenged by climate change as we move forward. So we're trying to stay on the cutting edge there.
Just a follow-up on that, I know you said that there isn't really an official synthesis scoping team. So what, maybe you already spoke to this during your talk, but like, what are the current processes you use to identify those topics?
That is a great question. I'm glad you asked it. And one thing I didn't do in this presentation, but I will just say, is that we are in the process of finalizing a synthesis guiding framework document for IEP. And it is written, it is in the final stages of review within IEP, and will be online, and I hope in the next iteration of the IEP newsletter. And in that, we lay out the process by which we identify synthesis topics. And really, it's two ways. One of them, and I talked about this a little bit, was the bottom-up way of you have scientists that are on the ground, they have ideas, they're close to the data, they're close to the system, And they may also have a really good sense of what the challenges are. So they may suggest synthesis topics, and they may know people that are capable and ready to do it. So that's one way. The other way is the top-down way, which is like Sassoon-Marsh salinity control gates, for example. That was a pretty high-level action, and we're not going to just do it and walk away. We're going to have to do some synthesis to evaluate it. So those are two ways. Since we do have some, I think the number is 5, staff within IEP across USBR, DWR, and CDFW that are dedicated to synthesis, or supposed to be, although they do get pulled away, is that at least anyone, these groups, these people, these staff, should be, any synthesis project they are leading, all those projects need to go through the IEP work planning process. And in that process, you get review. And in that process of review, we hope that we enhance collaboration and we hone the questions and the hypotheses and the analysis plan by letting our colleagues see what we're thinking first. So through the IEP work planning process and then leveraging project work teams, and I think one thing we can do is having a little bit more direct communication in between managers and the dedicated IEP synthesis staff. That would help to identify what managers really need.
Are there any other questions in the room?
Thanks, it was a great talk. I was wondering if you have any thoughts on, like, obviously it's really important to have these staff who are dedicated to synthesis and like get it to actually happen. But I wonder if you have any thoughts on sort of balancing then the issue that you have the people who are creating the data sets and the people using the data sets are not always the ones involved in creating the synthesis, and there could be some disconnects. Mm-hmm. And obviously this is an improvement because what's happening before is those people weren't doing syntheses anyway, but how do you like get them involved to make sure that what you're doing is relevant and is using the newest, greatest information out there?
Okay, I think, so is that a twofold question? One, how do we manage a disconnect between data collectors and synthesizers? And two, how do we know we're using the best analysis tools that are out there? Is that the second part?
No, the second part was just a reframing of the first one.
Okay.
Like,
okay. So the first question.
If there's a disconnect, then you might not be synthesizing the newest information that exists because you're not the one.
Oh, gotcha. Okay. Yeah. So that's a really great question. I appreciate it. It's important to me and important, I think, to many of us in IEP that we don't have synthesis working in a silo in an isolated sense. And so one thing, like one of the things I've been doing over the last month is who is going to evaluate the fish response to operating these salinity control gates. And one of the things that we've done is invite the people that are leading the surveys. And this is where there's a bit of a conundrum because they have a lot to do just by leading those surveys. In many cases, these are, in some cases, Ph.D. level scientists, and they want to do it. So they participate as they have time. That is a key thing, but we can't rely on their availability. So the other thing that we do to avoid that disconnect that you're talking about is we try to do a good job of sharing results, even early results, with project work teams, where many of these collectors of information are attending these project work teams. So those are two ways.
Hi. Thanks. I guess I was just hoping you could talk a little bit more about the distilled information part and the strategy.
That got the least amount of attention in this talk. I think the reason it's very important, it is something that we can do more of. It is another aspect of synthesis that is under-supported. I know that Department of Fish and Wildlife is working hard to get a science communication person. That would really help. But really, I think it's happening within each of the teams. The lead of the team and maybe some key right-hand people are helping to convey information. So, for example, I keep using the Sassoon Marsh Limited Control Gates, sorry, but I have been pretty closely involved with it. Ted Summer gave a video presentation of exactly what we were doing when it happened. And we leverage all their opportunities like the IEP workshop and the Bay Delta Science. You noticed, maybe you noticed there was a whole plenary and workshops on science communication. So I think we're in a stage of upping our game and learning how best practices for how to do it, and then reminding ourselves within our plans to conduct any single one of these analyses or these teams that has to be planned as well. The communication part can't be lost in the mix of we have all this data to analyze and we have not enough time to do it. We have to remember that that's part of our job as well. And we are getting better, but have more work to do.
Any other questions? I'm going to look online real quick to see if there are any. Okay, no questions online, but I do have one real quick question about in the beginning when you were defining synthesis. I was recently in a group where we were trying to define the difference between synthesis and review. Do you have any thoughts you can add to the difference between those two?
A review as a scientific, like a review article or something? Yeah. I think a review article is a synthesis
or a panel review.
Oh, a panel review. Well, I don't know, but I think it's a synthesis exercise to review any body of work and then pull out pieces of information that are worth revisiting, modifying. So I don't see. I wasn't part of that discussion, but I think it's a synthetic exercise, and that's kind of what I was saying. Maybe you responded to that part of the talk where I tried to say that synthesis isn't necessarily always quantitative. There's synthesis exercises just in thinking about something. So, and that has to be part of our work.
One of the things that we discussed in that conversation was are there recommendations provided in a synthesis versus a review?
Oh. I think that synthesis can provide recommendations, and I think it should. It's going to be responsive to management, but they should be science-based.
Last opportunity for questions. Oh, kind of take it.
Hi.
I was wondering, the audience seems to be the scientific community. I was wondering if you have considerations for broader audience, maybe looking at addressing these data to the general public.
Thanks for that question. One of the goals for our status and trends IEP showing our data is to reach out to the interested public. Because I don't think that, one, the Delta as a system, and certainly not all the extensive monitoring that goes on is really visible to the public now. And so that's a small effort to try to address that. Let's have an online presence for our program and show the data and make it digestible. That's the goal. So that's one of them. There is, I think, with your question, a very good question, and one that if we could do more broad outreach would provide a lot of, there's a long-term goal, maybe that would be more support for our program because it would just be more known about and valued. But there's a bandwidth issue. And if I made the point that many of our scientist staff that we have don't necessarily have synthesis in their job description, and most of them really don't have public outreach as one of their job description items. So that's the bandwidth issue. We have to decide to do that too.
Thank you so much. We really appreciate your talk.
Thanks for all the questions.